Hatton Garden in London has been the heart of Britain's discreet jewellery trade for centuries.
Sophisticated, ambitious, meticulously planned. The jury's now heard the Hatton Garden raid was the largest burglary in English legal history. Brian Reader, at 76, the oldest of the gang, the others called him Governor or the Master.
In 2015, a group of aging criminals pulled off one of the most infamous heists in British history, the Hatton Garden job. A crime so bold, so precise, that it left police scrambling for answers. How did they do it? Who were they? And who among them had the mind to plan it all? One name stood out: Brian Reader. A man in his 70s, yet still sharper than men half his age. The press called him the Master, the last of the old-school gentleman thieves. But his story didn't begin in the vaults of Hatton Garden. It started decades earlier, in the war-torn streets of Deptford. Before the diamonds, before the millions, before the legend, there was a boy. A boy who learned that survival wasn't about following rules, but breaking them. This is the story of Brian Reader's rise from street thief to criminal mastermind. The story of how London's underworld shaped him, how he built his empire, and how he became the man who would one day lead the greatest heist of a generation. Before we talk about Hatton Garden, we need to ask, where did Brian Reader come from? London, 1939, a city at war. Bombs rain down over the Thames, entire neighbourhoods vanish in fire, and London's poorest are left to fend for themselves. In the riverside tenements of Deptford, a boy is born. His name is Brian Reader. His father, Henry Reader, was a man who knew how to get by. A ducker and diver, he made his living shifting stolen goods, trading with men who operated in the shadows. Reader grew up watching, listening, absorbing. Crime was not a choice. It was survival. By 1945, as Britain celebrated the end of the war, Deptford remained unchanged. The slums still reeked of poverty. Food was scarce, work even scarcer. Crime filled the gap. Reader's father left. And at just 7 years old, Brian became the oldest male in the house. He was already learning that life did not wait for permission. Deptford's children became its street-level criminals. They learned young how to sneak, how to lie, how to lift a wallet without a sound. Reader was no different. By the age of 10, he was stealing bottles, cashing in their deposits, and working angles wherever he could find them. But it wasn't enough. He wanted more. At 11, Brian Reader committed his first real crime: 5 break-ins in a single night. He was caught, arrested, and brought before the authorities. But instead of fear, Reader felt pride. Among the boys of Deptford, a stint in the cells was a mark of respect. He was no longer just another street rat. He was becoming someone. The post-war years saw London's underworld thrive. The old criminal faces who had spent the war years locked up or in hiding came back in force. The newspapers gave them names: the king of the underworld, the dog doper, the gentleman crook. Reader watched them from the corners of smoky pubs and crowded streets, soaking in their reputations, studying how they moved. These men didn't work dead-end jobs. They lived by their own rules. By the time he was 15, Brian Reader had fully committed to a life of crime. Petty theft turned to organized work, stealing radios, breaking into shops, running scams. He left school with no regrets. What could a teacher offer him that crime could not? By the 1950s, London's crime world had evolved. The days of pickpockets and con men were giving way to something bigger: robberies, hijackings, security vans loaded with payrolls, guarded by men with little more than a baton. This was where the real money was. Reader, still a teenager, wanted in. But first, something interrupted his rise: national service. Like all young men of his generation, Reader was drafted into the British Army. He resisted, faking injuries, failing medicals, anything to avoid being dragged away from the streets he was mastering. But the system won. In 1955, he was enlisted. For 2 years, Reader played the part. But while others were shaped into soldiers, Reader was learning something different. Explosives, metal cutting, advanced mechanics. While his superiors thought they were training a recruit, they were giving a future criminal the exact tools he needed. By 1957, Reader was out of the army and back where he belonged, on the streets of South London. He returned with sharper skills, a better understanding of security, and most importantly, new contacts. The next step was inevitable. Bigger jobs, bigger risks, bigger rewards. Reader spent the 1960s embedded in London's expanding underworld. He learned from veteran thieves, perfecting his craft. Safe cracking, inside jobs, payroll heists. Every job built his reputation further. And then there was Hatton Garden. Hatton Garden was the beating heart of London's jewellery trade. Its vaults held millions in gold, diamonds and cash. Its security was sophisticated, but not unbeatable. Reader became obsessed. He studied the district, learning its weaknesses, its routines. It was not a question of if he would hit Hatton Garden, it was when. By the 1960s, London's underworld belonged to two families, the Krays in the east and the Richardsons in the south. One ruled with fear, the other with brutality. Brian Reader was watching. The Kray twins blended crime with celebrity, running nightclubs, protection rackets, and making rivals disappear. The Richardsons took a different approach: torture as punishment, pain as a warning. Teeth pulled, toes cut, bodies broken. Reader took notes. He saw how power worked, how fear controlled men. But he also saw the flaw: too much noise, too much attention. The Krays and Richardsons wanted to be infamous. Reader wanted to be invisible. While they made headlines, he stayed in the shadows. No gang wars, no hitmen. Just clean jobs and quiet getaways. The Krays wanted fear, the Richardsons wanted blood, Reader wanted success. By the late 1960s, Reader was no longer just another London thief. He was becoming a criminal strategist. He planned robberies like a businessman planned investments, carefully, methodically, with no room for error. The 1970s saw London's crime world explode. The post-war generation of criminals had refined their craft, turning what was once a chaotic game of smash and grab into organized, professional crime. Reader thrived in this new era. He was linked to a string of successful robberies, targeting post offices, security depots, and jewelers. His methods were clean, precise. The police took notice, but never had enough to pin anything on him. By the mid-1970s, Reader was an established name in the underworld. He was no longer a street thief. He was something else, a professional, a mastermind. He was patient, he was careful, and he was waiting for the right moment to make history. Brian Reader would not stop. He had his eyes on something bigger, something legendary. The world didn't know his name yet, but soon they would. Some men work for a living. Brian Reader, he worked to make history.